Manuel Pastor is professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Fight on. He currently directs the program for environmental and regional equity at USC and USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. Pastor's research has generally focused on issues of economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movements seeking to change those realities. His current research culminated in the release of his book, State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future. He will be doing a book signing today at 1 p.m. at the table with the booksellers. Pastor is the recipient of fellowships from Danforth, Guggenheim, Kellogg Foundations, and grants from numerous foundations such as Irvine, Ford Foundation, National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the California Endowment, and many others. Pastor speaks frequently on economic inequality, demographic change, and community empowerment, and has published pieces in many media outlets. He holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is the inaugural holder of the Terpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change at USC, my alma mater. Fight on. One more time for Manuel Pastor. No, I said one more time for Manuel Pastor.
So really glad to be with you. I think this is going to work out perfectly. Wasn't that a great panel that we just had? So we're running a little late, but it's okay because our indigenous brothers and sisters said they had no word for time, and my word for time is hora latina. So starting a little slow. You may wonder why an economist is actually speaking to you about belonging, particularly because it's said about economists, if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, they still couldn't reach a conclusion. And particularly after the financial crisis, some said that if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, it would be a good thing. But it's very clear that we need to be talking about the economy because when we talk about economics, it's often being used to divide communities and operate from a space of scarcity rather than abundance. And what I want to talk to you about is how do we move from resistance to renewal? How do we practice an economics of belonging, and in particular, a sort of solidarity economics for the 21st century? I'm going to move to this pretty quickly. I always like to let people know that when I'm speaking, that while I'm talking, my voice might break or become a little bit soft. You might think that it's because I'm emotional being with a lot of great organizers. That's part of the reason. But it's also that I have a voice condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. Diane Rehm on NPR had it. Now I do. And this is literally true. It gets treated once a month with Botox because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. It totally works for us. So what I want us to do is to kind of think a little bit about the challenge, and I want to leave you with one central message today, and I even made a mistake myself in talking about it, but it was kind of conscious. We often talk about the economy as though it's a set of rules out there that we did not make. It is our economy. It is a set of rules that we make that either reproduce injustice or reproduce opportunity. And it is up to us to change those rules, and the first step is to claim the narrative that is our economy and not a set of rules that others make for us. So, let me say a little bit about what sets the stage for this, is to understand the ways in which America is changing. As many of you know, by the year 2043, 2044, the U.S. will become a majority people of color nation. When people... I know I'm excited about it too. Others seem to be a little bit more fearful. They don't realize that there's Korean taco trucks in their future and what could be wrong with that. And when most people see that demographic change, they think it's actually being driven by immigration. But as many of you know, that's no longer the case. This shows you the share of foreign-born, that's the little orange rust bars at the bottom, and you could see it kind of was going up between 1990 and the mid-2000s, but between 2006 and the most recent data point, the share of foreign-born in the United States went up from a 12.5% to 13.5%. A startling increase, and certainly one that scares the nation. So really, it's no longer immigration that's driving this, demographic change. It's in fact the change in the youth population. What this shows you is the change in the youth population between 2000 and 2017 by race and ethnicity. The non-Hispanic white youth population actually fell by almost 7 million. Now, that does not mean that 7 million young white people died. Fox News would have reported on that and would have blamed it on Obama, for sure. What it means is that there's less white youth moving into 0 and 1 than moving into 19 and 20, so the net numbers are declining. You can see there's a small decrease in the African American population. Actually, most of that, if you look to the graph to the right, is because of black Americans marking themselves mixed race. But what's really driving the change is the youth population so well represented in this room. Big increase, more than 6 million in the young Latino population, about 1 million in the AAPI population. Big increase in people marking themselves mixed youth. So that change in the United States, going from the year 2000 to the year 2050, from about 69% non-Hispanic white to about 47% non-Hispanic white, that is majority people of color, that is exactly the demographic change that California went through between the years 1980 and 2000. California is America, just sooner. And in those 2 decades, there was tremendous tumult. Remember Prop 187, the elimination of bilingual education, the elimination of affirmative action, 3 strikes laws, etc. This kind of demographic diversity created for some demographic difference until people began to figure out how to do the kind of organizing in California to change the electorate and change the narrative. But this is going to happen in the rest of the country, because one of the things you'll notice if you look at that trend in California is that it's no longer the case that the demography is changing that much in California. When people hear that the United States will become majority people of color, what they imagine is that by the year 2050, California will become 150% Latino. Sort of super Chicanos marching the earth going, Aztlán y que la reconquista. We are back. But really it's going on in the rest of the country. And one of the things that's really helping to change and kind of create differences in our politics has to do with the age structure of the population. You can look here for some of the recent data for the median age, half older, half younger, of non-Hispanic whites. That median age is 43. For Asian Pacific Islanders, half older, half younger, 37. For Black Americans, African Americans, 34. Native Americans, 33. For Latinos, 28. So 43, 28, 15 years. It's a generation gap. It helps to explain our demographic change, because when you're 28, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 43, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may be. But it also helps to explain our politics, because an older generation is looking at a younger generation, not seeing itself in that generation, and not being willing to make the investments that are key for people to be able to succeed economically. Indeed, the state in the United States that has the biggest racial generation gap, that is the whitest old and the brownest young, is Arizona. With its fractious politics around immigration and ethnic studies into schools, and with the largest cuts until the recent teacher strike in K through 12 per student spending of any state in the United States. So part of the task of belonging is figuring out how do we build bridges between groups, how do we build bridges between generations, and part of what's kind of getting in the way, of course, is what's happened with the economy and the fact that so many of us on the left, on the progressive side of things, haven't got quite the right language to talk about these economic changes as well. So what's going on in the economy? First thing is that we know that the 1% is really running away from the rest of us. This shows you with the blue line. By the way, can you tell that I like graphs and charts? Yeah. So They are your friends. They are part of the data that we can use to make these kind of cases. But the 1% have really been running away from the rest of us, with the share of income going to the top 1% as high as it ever was in the United States during the Gilded Age and certainly right before the Great Recession. Even beneath that, though, there's something going on for people not below the 1%, but in the sort of working population. That is this is for full-time year-round workers, and what's going on with that is that for those at the 90th percentile, 10% make more, 90% make less. What's gone on is that their wage incomes have gone up, while those who are at the bottom of the wage distribution, their incomes have actually gone down. And you can see the gray bars are the United States, the rust bars are California. California is actually, just like California was America fast forward on the demographic change, California has been America fast forward on the economic inequality that's resulted. Why has this gone on? There's two things to kind of keep in mind. One is that there's been an enormous shift in the returns to education. Now, many of you have parents who told you to go to school, and they said that if you went to school, you'd make more money. That is true. But what is interesting about what's gone on in the economy is now the education premium is even bigger than it was in the past. So looking at California, for people with less than a high school degree and people with a post-grad degree, in 1978, their wage gap was only $16 an hour. Now that gap has doubled to $32 an hour. Easy way to remember this, I'm a professor. I make a lot more money than professors ever made because I can speak a few languages, I'm computer literate, I can talk to crowds. My dad was a janitor. If my dad was alive, he would make a lot less money than janitors made when he was alive. So there's been an education premium, and we talk about that all the time, don't we? Here's the thing we leave out, which is that in the last 40 years in California, and this pretty much parallels the nation, worker productivity went up by 90%, while worker real wages flatlined. So it's not just what people tell you that if we got more educated, that we would repair the damage in the economy. We need to get more power to be able to curtail corporate influence over decision-making and move investments in the directions that we need. This, of course, has a big racial dynamic to it. This is the share of groups living below 150% of the poverty line. Again, just looking at California, I'll come back to white California in a minute. But you can see tremendous disparities between African Americans and Latinos compared to the non-Hispanic white population, and something that most people don't pay attention to, which is that the Asian Pacific Islander population actually has higher rates of poverty as well, because it's a pretty bifurcated community with some doing well, some doing not so well. Now, one of the things to realize is that this is not something, the demographic differences, that's simply a function of education. Even when you control for education, here looking at groups with less than a high school diploma, some college, an AA degree, a BA degree or higher, with the gray bars being white and all the other bars being various groups of color, you can see that at each and every level of income, what's true? People of color make less, whites make more. That's for 1990. Here's the weird thing. Maybe not weird. If you move to the current period, the gap not only still exists, it's actually gotten worse. Once you control for income levels or education levels, you see an even larger gap in the wages whites receive relative to the rest. So one of the things that we need to accept is that racism has been baked into our economic structure, and that if we are going to try to really address these issues, we have to understand and acknowledge the centrality of race in the economy. And there's a gender dynamic here as well. If you look at the share of workers making less than $15 an hour in the United States, again, for every ethnic group, women have a higher percent of women who are making less than $15 an hour. So what's the solution? Maybe socialism. She certainly seems like she'd be happy about it. But what I want to do is plant a couple seeds about the way I think we need to sort of rethink our approach to the economy. First, we need to kind of reconceptualize work. Work is increasingly precarious, temporary, and part-time. I know this, not because of me, because I'm a professor and I have tenure, but I have a son who is an actor. I'm sorry, he's a musician and his backup career is as an actor. My daughter is an Uber driver. But for young people, work is increasingly precarious. People are going between jobs. It's very different. The other thing, I'm not going to go through all this, is unbelievably, what people don't understand is that work is increasingly caring. That doesn't mean that people care about workers. What it means is the following thing. When I tell you that there's going to be demographic change, what immediately pops to people's minds? Ethnic change, right? That's not the big change. In California, in the year 2010, 11% of the population was 65 years old or older. 2060, 26% of the population is going to be 65 years old or older. The big news is that we're aging. And as we age, we need to figure out how do we create family leave systems so people can take care of their elders, and how do we actually deliver high wages to the high-skilled people who provide labor for our elders. And I want to underline something here which I think is really important about the language we use, not just our economy, but how many of you, I never said anything about returns to skill. I talked about returns to education. Because here's the thing, how many of you have young kids? Okay, how many of you have elders that have some kind of care? Okay, now would you like to put your kids and your elders in the hands of low-skill people? You don't. You know that that takes tremendous skill. You know that if you're a farm worker, that takes tremendous skill. You know that if you're a janitor and you're making a building clean like my dad did, that's a tremendous skill. We have to start talking about skilled work and the disconnection between skilled work and low wages for that work. That's really what we need to address. The second thing we need to understand is power in our economy. And we need to understand that power is going to be different right now for a couple of different reasons. One is that in the old days of the 19th century and the robber barons, you had monopolists who would actually corner a market by buying more and more of a replicative process. That is, they would buy more oil wells or they would buy more steel plants, and they would begin to corner the market that way. That is, it was really a strategy to create those kind of monopoly power. Right now, monopoly power is a feature of innovation. How many of you use a rideshare program? How many of you use a rideshare program not called Uber or Lyft? Okay, congratulations, 3 of you raised your hands, right? The way that these markets work right now is there's a big first mover advantage, and those groups wind up seizing lots of power, and they have lots of power over your data. And one of the things we need to be insisting on is a data dividend, in which the information that we're providing comes back to us in the form of a universal basic income. I talked about race. The other thing I think that we need to be understanding is that we need to really rethink the way economists do their work. For the most part, economists operate with the idea that people operate out of their self-interest. And if you're conservative, you think that markets will kind of, get that self-interest to yield a blissful outcome. If you're more left, you may wind up thinking that the state needs to tame that self-interest. What we need to understand, and I'll get to those questions in a minute, is that people also operate out of a sense of solidarity. And how do we encourage solidarity in our economy? Something I'll come back to. What I do want to say is that if we want to have a new framework for our economy, we need to think about the responses that took place during the last great economic crisis of the Great Depression. It had 3 central elements to it, the New Deal. One was figuring out how to grow the economy, Keynesian macro policy, and provide opportunity. A second was figuring out how to connect communities something like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which allowed rural America to be part of the mainstream economy. And the third part of it was providing security for people through Social Security and unemployment insurance. Those are the kind of poles we need to come back to, but we need to change them for our era. Why? Because security is no longer based in companies, big companies like it was in the past. It needs to be society-wide. That means portable benefits. That means family leave policies. That means a whole series of things. Second, we need to understand, admit, and lift up that the New Deal was racist to its core. It was affirmative action for white people, as Guy Katz-Nelson talked about. And as a result, we can't do that again. We can't create a system of connecting people that excludes people. We need to connect everyone. And then finally, we can't grow like we did in the 30s. The way that we grow now is by learning to love the planet Earth and moving to a green economy. So we did a report called From Resistance to Renewal, a 12-step program for the California economy, with the idea being that California should recover from its addiction to inequality and racism. And I urge you to take a look at this. There's kind of 12 concrete steps that really point to what could happen in a more pragmatic way. But I hope that this was of some interest. I'll take some questions, and then I will deliver a stirring and emotional conclusion at the end. Great. Well, these are easy questions. So how do we build real multiracial alliances without losing the power of our community's unique experience and struggle? That's easy. How do we balance the work to win elections and to win real transformations in the long run? Another simple question. And what strategies did organizers in California use to transform toward greater equity? Whoosh. So let me answer that by talking about the California experience, where I think, and by the way, that is the book that I will be signing at 1 p.m., State of Resistance. It's a really good book. It's about to be made into a major motion picture. It's one of the reasons I wasn't here yesterday. I was negotiating the rights. I was going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. Turns out it's George Lopez, but it is a movie, so kind of excited about it happening. But when you think about the transformation in California, what I want to say is I think that there were sort of three kind of fundamental aspects to the transformation of politics in California that really get to the questions that were asked about multiracial analysis and the relationship between with electoral strategies. The first was kind of interesting, the development of making sure that movement politics could meet electoral politics. Now, this is partly because in the 1990s, many of us who were on the left, who were progressives, kind of got tired of losing. You know, many of us who are kind of progressive, we feel really proud when we lose, like we really stuck to our values. But we lost, right? And when we lost, people's lives were damaged. And as a result, people started saying, how do we actually transform and change the electorate? And the way that that happens is through something called integrated voter engagement. So that rather doing get out the vote, where what you do is you go at the time of elections and you grab the people who you know are already going to vote and you move them to vote, and the other side is doing exactly the same thing. You patiently work between elections to develop relationships with people so that when you call on them, you're calling on the new and occasional voters who could actually change the electorate. Now, the advantage of that, of having community organizing meet electoral politics, is that you can then also use people's active voting as a way to get them to go to demonstrations or city council meetings or planning commission meetings to do the real daily politics that makes a difference. The second thing I think that was kind of fundamental in California politics was beginning to practice the kind of thing that was being talked about here, intersectionality, that is understanding what our own struggles were for Latinos or immigrants or African Americans or LGBTQ folks, understanding intersectionality and beginning to use a rhetoric and a language that would seek to move the middle rather than move to the middle. So talking about the dream for dreamers, talking about marriage equality, seeking to move the middle rather than move to the middle, take a half measure. The other thing that I think was really important was the development of a geographic strategy. My shorthand for this is, there is not one more liberal voter in Berkeley. If someone is conservative in Berkeley, that person is determined and resistant to every social norm around them which tells them they're an oddity. Where we need to be organizing is in those places, and that's what Californians did, is to begin to organize in those parts of the United States and in those parts of California where there are people that you can move, where there are new and occasional voters you can animate. In the last election, for example, California in Orange County, the birthplace of the John Birch Society and all sorts of right-wing politics, went completely blue. Which is the first time that's happened since the dawn of man. So one of the things that we need to realize is this kind of, change the electorate, move the middle, run everywhere. That's what Beto O'Rourke did in Texas. That's what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. That's what Andrew, and she won. That's what Andrew Gillum did in Florida. Those three elements, and that's what we need to do nationwide. Now, one last thing. We will, in order to get there, need to have we need to have big hearts about welcoming everyone into the tent. We're going to need to have a hard head about tackling concentrated wealth and power and challenging racism and other dominations. But we're also going to have to learn to practice deep solidarity, and this is where I want to end. I was at a meeting a couple of years ago, and my good friend Gerald Lenoir, who's one of the founders of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, had one of the best icebreakers for a meeting I'd ever heard of, participated in. He said, you should tell us something your mama told you. Like something your mother told you that really stuck with you. And it was like really beautiful. It was a group of people, it's about 30 people, about 25 African American. They were really kind of going through these great stories about what their mother told them about faith and education. And all I could think of was my mom, who grew up in Spanish Harlem, who spoke like a truck driver in both languages, right? When I was growing up, I did not know that coño y carajo were not words everybody used. For those of you who are Spanish challenged, there'll be translations later. So I kept racking my brain, but the one thing that kept coming back to me that my mom always said was, you never cross a picket line. You never cross a picket line. Now, she was a very labor-oriented person, and that's what she literally meant, but she meant more than that. She meant you don't cross someone else's struggle. When immigrants are speaking up around the issues of immigration, you do not cross that picket line. When our trans brothers and sisters are raising questions about transphobia, we do not cross that picket line. When African Americans and others are making us aware of the racist nature of our so-called criminal justice system, which should simply be called an incarceration system, we do not cross that picket line. We stand in solidarity. And if we understand that what was good enough for my mother is good enough for our struggle and is good enough for building our economy, we will make a change. Thank you.